In our parish we have the whole wall of holy things, and I believe that many people even don't know the history of these things. Father Victor, can you explain what is this?
I'd be happy to, because this has been hanging here for many years now. And it has a very interesting history, these items, these icons, and these photographs. As I mentioned the last time we met in church, and I spoke a few words about the icons of St. John of Shanghai and San Francisco, I mentioned in passing that Vladika came to Washington, Vladika Jan came to Washington in 1949 and founded our parish. Well, he came to Washington from the Filipino island of Tubabao. This is a place, a miserable place, where close to 5,000 Russians, I'm not really sure of the number, but about 5,000 Russians, found a temporary refuge. These Russians came from China, where they were living a relatively good life. Many of them fled Soviet communism from Siberia, from the Far East, settled in China. Other Russians lived in China, in cities like Harbin, which were predominantly a Russian city because of the Trans-Siberian Railroad and other industries. Well, when the Communist Chinese army was coming closer to Shanghai and Hankou and other Chinese cities where Russians resided, they began making plans to flee the country. And one of the international refuge rescue organizations turned to various countries to plead on the Russians' behalf to accept them. And the only country that agreed to take in these Russian refugees were the Filipinos. And the Russians were given an area of an island called Tubabao, which was not far from a big island of Samar. It was connected with a bridge to Samar. And it was a desolated place, and the Russians had to organize their lives there. And among the first things that they did was to erect churches. The Russians began coming to Tubabao, I believe, in January 1949, and the last that arrived came there in May. And they erected churches made of tents, like big army tents. And Vladika John was there with them, and he did everything in his power to help them leave, because they were living in conditions of a jungle, humid conditions, infested with insects, and the Russians who were living there lived as best they could. They organized a library, schools, where the children were taught, and of course churches. And two of these churches were made of tents, as I mentioned. So the first Russians arrived in January 49. The last came in May. In July the 12th, Vladika John came to Washington to lobby on behalf of his flock who were stranded on this island before Congress. And during his time in Washington, as I mentioned in greater detail before, during our other interview, Archbishop John founded our parish. Well, many years later, in 2004, one of my parishioners by the name of Tatyana Deyev passed away. Her grandfather was a well-known priest in the Russian emigration, Father Nikolai Kolchev, who was with Vladika John on the island of Tubabao. He was one of them who left Tubabao. He made it to San Francisco, where he became the rector of the church in San Francisco named after the Kazan, Mother of God. And Tatyana Deyev, the granddaughter of this priest, had many of his possessions, books, icons, and documents and photographs. Father Nikolai's brother, older brother, Father Leonid Kolchev, was an even better known priest because he was a court priest for the royal family. And he served in the Crimea, in Livadia. And after the revolution, the civil war, he fled to Constantinople. And the Dowager Empress, Maria Feodorovna Romanova, who was from Denmark, she was living in Denmark after the execution of her son and her grandchildren in Yekaterinburg. And she heard that Father Leonid, who was her priest in Livadia, was living in Constantinople in a very bad situation. She asked him to come to Copenhagen, where he became the priest of the Russian church there. And he became the father confessor to the Dowager Empress. By the way, I'm wearing his cross. This is Father Leonid's cross. So the two Kolchev brothers were famous Russian priests in the Russian emigration. So Tatyana Deyev, my parishioner, kept many of their things, including this cross, icons, and other holy items and theological books. When Mrs. Deyev passed away, our church received many of Father Nikolai's and Father Leonid's things. Some of them are in the church. I have some of his books at my home. And when we had to take all of these things from her apartment, and we cleaned out her apartment, a very small apartment, because the apartment had to be rented to other people. After we had removed everything, the manager of the apartment complex called me and said that she found under her bed, Mrs. Tadeyev's bed, a number of, as she said, religious pictures. What should I do with them, she asked me. I said, don't do anything, I'll come over and see what they are. And under her bed were these icons wrapped in blankets. Also this epitaphion, Plashenitsa. Well, I took these icons, thinking that I would eventually give them to a poor parish, maybe a mission in our Eastern American diocese, who couldn't afford to have painted icons in their church. And I put them away for safekeeping. And then I began rummaging through the boxes of photographs that Mrs. Deyev left also. And I was particularly interested in photographs of hierarchs and priests of the Russian emigration for historical purposes. And suddenly I came upon a small envelope with the black and white photographs. And on the envelope in hand with pencil was written Tubabao. Well, of course, a bell rang in my mind. Tubabao is, of course, the island where Vladika John and his flock were, and from there he came to Washington. So I began looking at these photographs, and I could recognize that these icons, I saw them in the photographs. And if we look here, I blew some of these photographs up, I magnified them, and you can see that this is a tent church. A church in a tent on the island Tubabao. And here you see these two archangels, Michael and Gabriel, the icon of the Mother of God. And these are the icons that were under Mrs. Dieva's bed, that were brought from Tubabao by Father Nikolai, her grandfather. Unfortunately, the icon of Christ that is here in this photograph, I never found. But this Ploshchenitsa was with these icons, so they obviously came from this church. Now, why is this special? It's special because this is where Vladika John prayed before he came to Washington on January 12th, 1949. And 2 months later, served the very first liturgy in our church, which marks the beginning of our parish. So for me, and I hope for those watching, just having these icons, the very same icons Vladika John prayed for before coming to Washington, is a miracle. It's a magnificent miracle. Of course, this also came from the collection of Father Nikolai. He brought them from Tubabao. There are other pictures, gas canisters which were used as bells. Here, I suspect Father Nikolai is blessing the place where the church was erected. Or maybe he was blessing water. I can't make it out. But also in this cabinet here, we have icons from the 19th century, which were also amongst the things that Mrs. Dieva was keeping in her apartment and landed here in our church. So this is, as I said, this is a small miracle, but a very important miracle for us, Russian Washingtonian. This very Ploshchenitsa where Vladika served the last Good Friday of 1949 on the island of Tubabao before coming to Washington. And of course I have a little text which I prepared. People are welcome to read it when they come here, and these are like museum pieces for us. This is, of course, to those who don't know it, we're standing in the old parish house on the second floor in the living room. But this is a good place because we can sit on the sofa and look at these beautiful icons and remember our founder, Archbishop John.
So do you know how old all these icons, these Ploshchenitsa?
I've never had them studied by specialists, but I suspect they were probably painted in the 20th century, possibly in China, most likely in China, and then, as I said, brought to the Philippines, to the island of Tubabao. This is a style of iconography that was prevalent for churches in China, for Russian churches in China. And of course, in most Russian churches in the 19th century.
Many of our parishioners also came from Tubabao. Did you hear the stories, their stories about these tent churches, about maybe these icons?
Well, the only one I heard, which I can remember, is by Nikita Moravsky. Nikita Moravsky later on went to work for the State Department. He was at Voice of America, I remember him. He wrote a book about the island of Tubabao. He was a young man on the island of Tubabao, and he remembers these churches. He remembered, he passed away. And a few other parishioners, but they didn't go into great detail. And most of the people who lived on the island of Tubabao, they passed away before I found these icons. Mm-hmm. Of course, had they lived and seen these icons, I could have gotten a lot more information about them. But I think I discovered that these icons were from the island of Tubabao probably in 2005. This was about a half a year, 8 months after Mrs. Dieva, who was keeping these icons, passed away.
Thank you.
You're welcome.